He didn't say anything about guns.
Well, you're live, but we just lost Lucy.
Oh, yeah, she looks kind of frozen there. Are we live? Oh, we're all live. Hello, everyone. I'm waiting for my my co-pilot, Lucy. She was there a second ago, but her internet connection must be iffy. So let's give her a minute or so, because I don't want to drone on by myself for an hour. That would be cruel and unusual punishment, I'm sure. Let's check in with the chat room. Well, I see hello from Lucy in the chat place. But she's not back yet. Oops, her picture just disappeared. Whoop, am I there? Anybody hearing me? If you can hear me, answer on the chat in the chat window. Can you hear me? I'm not getting an answer. Is our producer there? No one. Oh. Ah, okay. Lucy's back in chat. Does that mean she's back with her camera? There she is. You're back.
What horrible timing,
She's back.
ladies and germs.
You always have to make a dramatic entrance, don't you?
Yes, apparently my internet is a drama queen, even if I am not.
A true libertarian diva. You can't just be there.
I was going to do a classy introduction and say all the right things and make it even better than the last time, and then my internet said, nope.
Okay, you get your chance now. You get your chance now. I hadn't started.
You hadn't started, but oh, Lord.
We're waiting for you.
Hi out there. Welcome to Liberty.me Live. This is free association, and the internet, we'll see how that works out for all of us. I am Lucy Steigerwald, as you probably know, and you definitely know Sheldon Richman and his many fine works in his Patreon and his free association blog, and you should give him money for all of his lovely works and hire him for writing purposes. I don't know. Just give him hierarchy. He's your libertarian better. Hierarchy. And what, more to the point, are we talking about this evening, Sheldon?
Guns, and more guns.
Oh, all right then. Well, would you like to start us off and talk about what you wrote?
Yes, I will do that. Well, of course, as this group knows, I'm sure, with that horrible shooting, when was it, last week, the week before in Oregon, and then there's been a couple things since then. There have been the usual calls for doing something, and it doesn't seem to matter that the most popular somethings would not have prevented any of these incidents. So that seems, for some reason, that's not of interest to people on the other side of this issue. It's that old line about we need to do something, this is something, therefore we need to do it. I submit that that's a logical fallacy. Anything is something. Nothing is something. So I guess if we have to do something, make it nothing. Or we would actually say undo some things. So the article that I wrote under the auspices of the Independent Institute, I guess last week, has gotten picked up in a few newspapers. It's been at Liberty.me. You can find it around. It's been on Reason. Tried to make a point. I mean, this is nothing that hasn't been said before, but I'm trying to put it in a way that might make some impact on people that have not been open to these arguments before. But my point was that any solution that's premised on the idea that you can you can keep guns away from bad people is a utopian solution. And I'm using you can use utopian in a lot of senses. There's a good sense, I guess we libertarians sometimes use it. Hayek used it. But I mean in the sense of, it's another world that's not achievable, however you might like it. And I used an anecdote. I remember a few years ago there was some big gun rally in D.C., and I saw Rosie O'Donnell being interviewed on, I think it was the Sunday morning, so it was whatever the ABC show is this week, or I forget what it's called. And so she was asked by, it was a good question actually by the anchor, who asked her, well, it seems that in states where concealed carry laws are permits are very easy to get, these shall issue states where they have to give you the permit unless you are disqualified because of some objective things, like you've been convicted of a felony, or there are a few things there. Otherwise, they have to issue it. So the question was to her, in light of the fact that the drop in violent crime in these states, in shootings in particular, in those states, and more than half the states have adopted these laws, that drop in crime seems even steeper than the national drop in crime. Doesn't that maybe hold a solution, or at least not a total solution, but at least doesn't it offer a way to curtail these kinds of shootings? And her response was, I don't want to arm everybody. I want to take the guns away from the bad guys. And I remember having like the instant reaction, okay, so do I, but what do we do in the meantime? And so think about how utopian that answer is. There's the question of how would you do that if it's even possible? And think about it. And number two, what do we do in the meantime? It's certainly not going to be done by midnight tonight. So what do us innocent people who may need to defend ourselves do in the meantime? And that's not a question that's even on the radar screen of people like that, who glibly call for things which in no way, wouldn't have stopped any of these recent tragedies. The go-to solution these days, of course, is expanded background checks. It's so easy to say. Universal is the term they use. Universal background checks. There's no such thing as universal background check. It's an impossibility, because we know that people with bad intent will go and get their guns in a place where there's no background check. How do you do that? Well, you go in the black market. They're not doing background checks in the black market. I guess we could pass a law saying the black market has to do background checks. While we're at it, why don't we just outlaw the black market? Oh yeah, that's right. It's already outlawed. That's why we call it the black market. Or people steal their guns. They break into homes and steal guns. I guess we could demand that homeowners, victims of theft, before they let the burglar leave the house, run a background check on him. Okay, we could pass a law like that. It's a pretty absurd law. So they're not going to be universal background checks. That's utopian. Even if you thought it was a good idea, that's utopian. It's not going to happen. So why do they keep saying it over and over again? And all the solutions kind of run this way. The so-called gun show loophole, which relates to background checks. They don't even put proper labels on these things. It's not a gun show loophole. Private sales, there are no background checks in most states, I guess. There are no background checks required on private sales, right? If I sell a gun, I have an extra gun I don't want, and Lucy's interested in buying a handgun, I can arrange to sell it to her privately, and I don't have to run a background check, depending on what state I am in. I think most states it's not required. So if a lot of private sales occur at gun shows, so those are not required to have background checks. So it's not a gun show loophole. You may call it a private sale exception. Loophole usually means something overlooked, not something deliberately written into a law. So anyway, that would have had nothing to do with it, because most of these shooters recently passed background checks, and the ones that may or may not have got their guns from their mothers, like Adam Lanza, or they got somebody else, or they already broke the law. So I mean, the Columbine guys were under 18, under 21. They weren't legally allowed to own guns. There were already laws against that, but somehow, oh my gosh, they did it. So what's the law going to do? Anyway, that's what I tried to show, that it was utopian, and it's better to be realistic and think about what we can do realistically, which leads to then questions about concealed carry, or thoughts about concealed carry, the wisdom of gun-free zones, and so on and so forth. I'll stop there and give you a chance to say something.
Well, it was I'm less prolific these days. I was never very prolific, and you and a couple other people kind of hit the mark. That pun was not intended. I apologize for that. I'm just trying to talk to maybe a liberal audience and saying, okay, you want this, how's it going to go, and when's it going to happen? And as you say, what do we do in the meantime? And you keep saying utopian, which I think is a fabulous way of describing this mentality, because I think liberalism, as, they stole the word, etc. American liberalism today, it's this pessimistic utopianism. It's very bizarre to me because it says we can somehow go like this and the guns will be gone if we pass just the right law, but somehow people are horrible and they need 10,000 laws to keep them in place. And it's just this, we can have this perfect situation, we can stop all the bad guys if we just find the right law.
Yeah.
But people are awful and need to be controlled by laws. I mean, it's a very disheartening mixture of ideas that they have, and this is certainly one of them. I want to ask them, and I think maybe the more intellectually honest liberal might try to, they'd be guessing, obviously. Anyone thinking up policy dreams is guessing, but some of them might at least suggest something that might work. A great deal of them literally just say, ban all semi-automatic, gun show loophole, etc. All those things you're saying, and and so it will happen. It's a magical incantation. If you say it, it will follow. And these are often the exact same people who have been absolutely on board with the police are running amok thing. My God, the prisons are full. How in God's name do they think those things will go together?
Yeah.
Stop and frisk, in New York City, that policy that, disproportionately hit minorities, it dehumanized harassment daily or weekly for hundreds of thousands of people a year getting stopped, or at least hundreds of thousands of stops, I guess. Often that was about guns.
Yep.
And even when that was still going on, liberals never wanted to mention that because that, again, conflicted with these two things. They know an ounce of weed isn't a big deal, but they weren't, sometimes they were looking for that. They would trick people into revealing their weed, and then it was, the crime was more criminal. I forget exactly. But they haven't put these, they're compartmentalizing these two things, these two issues, and they're still doing it after this shooting.
Right. You used a good word there that I was going to raise, incantation. Because another article I did the week before I did this one on utopianism, it was the same angle, but I used different terms. It was I was contrasting magic versus logic. Now, when you're thinking in the sense of problem solving, what we mean by that is that you apply reason to come up with means that are reasonably related to the end. In other words, that you can demonstrate have a reasonable chance of achieving the end. That's what we mean by thinking in the sense of problem solving. So if someone says, I want X, and someone says, well, how are you going to get that? And you say, oh, I'm going to use method Y, and the person explains what the connection is, then and it seems reasonable, you'll say, okay, it sounds like you've thought this through, and yeah, that seems like it has a good chance of accomplishing what you want to accomplish. If on the other hand you say something that's that's totally unrelated to the end, and the person can't even explain how it can achieve the end, you're going to think you're going to say to that person, perhaps, you haven't thought this through. In other words, you haven't even thought. It's not thinking. It's something else. And it's more like a belief in magic. Like if you say the right words, if you give the incantation, like you say, somehow the end will be achieved. We don't need to think about it. It just will. So all we need to say is universal background checks, or pass some piece of, have the Congress put through a piece of paper through a process that says at the top, bill to establish universal background checks, and then everything will be fine somehow. It's like the underwear gnomes, right? In what was it, South Park? I don't know this story firsthand, but Steve Horowitz tells it all the time. Right? It's the business plan for making profit by with used underwear. So step one in the business plan is steal the underwear. And then step 2 is a big question mark, and the third step is, make profit. You don't need to fill in that question. There's a big question mark that they don't feel they have to identify. So it's not thinking. So maybe we can appeal to people on those grounds and at least get them to see that they're not thinking. Now, the other point you made, which is always also great, someone's telling me to turn down my volume. Okay, I'm too loud. I'm sorry.
I was trying to be suave, dude.
Sometimes I talk too loud. Sometimes I don't talk loud enough. Okay, if that's not better, let me know. Or if it's too low, let me know. So the point you made about what it would take to get guns out of people's hands is a really good point. You need a full police state. There are 300 million guns in the U.S. There are 240 million, I believe, adults. I guess that's 21 and up. I'm not sure about that. Doesn't matter. So think what it would take to get those guns. A lot of people who don't like guns think that we should mimic what Australia did after that terrible shooting, 35 people killed by one person in 1996, I think it was, where they enacted not only a ban, I think, on semi-automatic rifles, which are the most popular selling guns in the United States, I read today, semi-automatic rifles. But they had a so-called buyback program for handguns. Now, 2 things about that I want to point out. I hate the term buyback because since the government didn't sell you the gun, how can I be buying it back from you? So that's an attempt to make it, I don't know, sound nice or something. The second thing is it was a compulsory program. In other words, it was confiscation. They gave you some money, but it was confiscation. Now, I read today on the Federalist Society site by an article by a historian. I linked to it on my Facebook page. You can find it. The buyback acquired only, well, I won't say only yet, 650,000 to 1 million guns. That's the range of the estimated number of guns, handguns, that the government acquired through its so-called buyback program. That sounds like a lot of guns, except it's only 1/5 to 1/3 of the guns. So when people say mass shootings disappeared after this Australia law, so we should do that, they seem to be forgetting that up to two-thirds of the guns that people own, handguns, are still in the hands of Australians. There wasn't widespread gun ownership in Australia anyway, but they didn't get most of the guns. So if the rate of violence fell or gun crimes fell in Australia, there's no reason to think it's because of the gun law, because 2/3 of the guns were left in the existing, the hands that they were there before the law. So there's all kinds of nonsense that gets thrown around, and no attempt to break it down.
Not to mention, what is the population of Australia? It's honestly, offhand, I don't know, but I know it's much smaller.
Yeah, it's smaller, and I read today in a defense of the law by the Prime Minister, the former Prime Minister of Australia, when he was trying to push the law in the United States. He had an op-ed in the New York Times saying, hey, you guys ought to do this. I think it was after Sandy Hook. He mentioned that, Australia really is not like the United States. For one thing, he pointed out that they have a much more urbanized population than we do. 60% of Australians live in cities.
I mean, you think it's all kind of more Wild West than here because of its history, but most of them are right by the coast in the big cities. And I just looked it up. 23.13 million people. That is tiny. That is absurdly
right. And there was not widespread gun ownership. There was a permit system before this law, the 1996 law. So gun clubs, people in gun clubs could get guns. It was restricted already. And I also saw a chart that showed that gun violence was falling before the enactment of the law. So, of course, you had this spike with the 35 people killed in a single incident, terrible, terrible thing, but that doesn't tell you about any kind of trend. That's one data point. If it was already falling before the date of the law, they're so typical of misuse of statistics. We see it all over the place, right? You'll see a chart with a line like this. So this is like the relevant year as far as the chart maker is concerned, and he's showing, oh, look, after we did something here, the bad thing started to fall. Except if you go back here, it was already falling. I mean, where you cut your chart off is where the edge of the paper is extremely important. So always be suspicious when you see a time along here, and then whatever the bad thing is here. Wonder what went on before the chart begins, because that can put a whole different light on the picture.
I mean, I'm a little surprised. I guess I don't know my Australian history as much as I'd like, but the fact that Australia was not as gun-centric a society as you might guess, not knowing the bare facts about its convict and awkwardly racist origins and things like that. It is surprising, but I mean, I don't know. You still get this just clueless optimism, and well, you think we can't do that here, like just because it's a different country? I mean, there's just this sort of flailing towards, well, again, we have to do something, and I mean, I think that's, unfortunately, it's either a natural human response or it's one that's been trained over centuries of statism, or even past 150 years, 200. I have no idea, but they can't handle this concept of not doing anything, because that's what we've been doing. And they also, and this is something I think is a common human response, is they think that crime is getting worse, or at least these mass shootings are getting worse.
Great point.
People always believe crime is getting worse whenever you ask them, no matter what.
Right. And
they also, I mean, there are certain sort of dramatic aesthetic horrors that come out of this type. Every type of horrific event, is unique, and there are different horrible, kind of captivating stories that come out of it. Columbine was chock full of them. This one had that horrible part where the guy, like, the shooter spared him so he could, turn in his fucking manifesto and stuff. That dude's probably traumatized for his life. That's disturbing. It's some ways more disturbing than just like two idiots exchanging gunfire on a corner. There's something about it, and I can understand it being more sort of captivating and disturbing, but we always go too far from that and act as if it's more tragic. And it doesn't really matter unless you're talking about, sadism and excessive torture. At the end of the day, like, you can't fix dead, and we have this habit of making it seem like whomever the media gets stuck on, those are the people who really are just worth more, and they're worthier victims. The Chomsky thing, and it's just what makes it so. It's because we think it's more interesting. That's not enough. Yeah. No, you made a lot of good points there. You pointed about crime. People thinking crime is at an all-time high. In fact, violent crime of all kinds is at historic lows. I mean, rivaling the early 60s, I think. And gun homicides are historically low. So we have this cluster of shootings, which it's reasonable to think there's a copycat element there. Sure. But that's the only thing that's up, if it's truly up. I mean, I don't know how the statistics look there, but there's certainly been a cluster. But if it was a gun issue, then you would think you'd see a rise in gun crimes across the board, assaults and murders and rape at gunpoint. But we're not seeing that. In fact, gun ownership by household has been falling, which took me by surprise. I didn't think that would be the case, but apparently it's the case. So, this one kind of crime stands out. Alienated white guys, right, who possibly are looking for fame with the 24/7, cable news operations. And so Charles Cook of the National Review, who's really a sharp guy, has written some really good stuff on guns lately and over the last couple of years, tells a horrible story of a guy, I forget what state he was in, who was caught before he was able to do anything. But he had this elaborate plot to kill his parents with a .22 caliber rifle, which wouldn't make very much noise, and then set a fire to distract the first responders and police, and then go to a school with bombs filled with nails and stuff, and set that off. But also had guns with him
to get any students that survived the blast. Now, he got caught before any of this happened. So Cook says, look, this is not a problem. This is not a gun problem. Why are kids, I forget the age of this guy. He was either a late teenager, I guess a late teenager. Yeah. Why are kids thinking up this stuff, that they want to kill their fellow students? And that's what we need to think about. and then that takes us in other directions. If you think it's a gun problem, it just doesn't add up.
Well, I mean, to play semi-devil's advocate for a second, I mean, with Columbine, the shooters attempted to build pipe bombs and like a couple of sort of propane, I forget, like larger bombs. Basically, all failed. I mean, they had these really frightening, sort of megalomaniacal plans to, kill hundreds of people and, kill the whole world, and they killed a comparatively small number. I mean, 13 is plenty, but they killed people with guns, not the explosives, because it is easier to learn how to, kill people with a gun if you have access to one than it is to build a working explosive. Okay. So, I mean, the ease, I think, to acknowledge that guns are a very convenient tool for both suicide and homicide, that is true. But, I mean, so what, I mean, that's a rational acknowledgement to make, but, nothing particularly follows from that, policy-wise, not in the world we have today.
Right. The Tsarnaevs, of course, didn't use guns.
Right.
At Boston, they used a pressure cooker, so we're going to have pressure cooker universal background checks on pressure cookers. Right. I believe no gun was used by Timothy McVeigh. How many people did he kill with fertilizer? 160
something.
So, people want to be suspicious of this, too easy answer. Mm-hmm. Oh, we can. Okay, maybe they won't say totally prevent. Maybe they realize even that's crazy. But we can substantially, make a dent in this problem if we have universal background checks. I mean, do they really believe? It's hard to believe that they believe it. And the people, and as what Cook and these other guys have pointed out that I've been reading today, want to stress is that anytime someone says, well, we're going to do what Australia did, and don't forget, Obama has praised the Australian law. Mm-hmm. We need to strip away the shroud there and say, oh, you're calling for confiscation of guns. Because that's what it was, a mandatory sellback, and they appropriated money with a special tax to buy the guns. But it was mandatory, and a lot of articles don't mention it was mandatory.
Which seems
First of all, are bad guys going to sell their guns to the government under a mandatory or voluntary system? Why would they?
Or not even, I'm sorry, not even bad guys. Simply people who are going to turn into criminals because they're stubborn, right, because they're clinging to their guns and their religion, as was once said by a president.
That's right. And we know what... Sorry, go ahead. I interrupted.
No, I was going to say that those people, I mean, honestly, even conservatives, I wrote something for the Federalist where I was trying to point out that semi-conservative pundit S.E. Cupp wrote this hideous article where she was all, not everyone pardoned by Obama is like a safe guy who had too much pot in his house. This one guy was convicted for several drug felonies, and he had a gun he wasn't supposed to. And he had, this man had life in prison for a couple of, possession with intent to distribute and then possessing a firearm as a felon. Yeah. None of that is a violent crime. None of those things are violent crimes. And Cupp seemed unable to realize this. She was fear-mongering. It was absurd. So I read this thing for the Federalist, a conservative website with some libertarian sympathies on occasion. And I wrote about Brian Aitken and Shaneen Allen, these people who were threatened with 7-10 years in prison, particularly because New Jersey is stupid. Their gun laws are horrible. But there are other cases. Families Against Mandatory Minimums has these horror stories where they will stack on these absurd charges thanks to the firearm minimums. So you have a gun at home, you can add something, you have a gun strapped to you during your drug sale, you never take it out, you never threaten anybody, but it's on your person. It can add decades. It's absolutely insane. And neither liberals nor conservatives have acknowledged this over the past few decades. The commenters hated me. All they could see was felons. You can't give felons firearms. These are the gun nerd NRA freaks in theory,
Yeah.
and they absolutely were terrified of this argument that, hang on, some of these people aren't even violent. They're getting punished, and their treasured constitutional right that you claim to love so much is being taken for these absurd reasons.
Yeah.
So not only are liberals not acknowledging this clash with their supposed dislike of the prison state, but conservatives are not acknowledging, even though they love their guns so much, supposedly.
So
it's terrible.
no, you're absolutely right. And when they say nobody wants to take your guns away, and then in the next breath they say, but the Australian plan was really good. That's a contradiction. That's a lie, because that was taking people's guns away, even though they didn't get most of them. They got no more than a third of the guns. And one of the things that that Prime Minister, now former Prime Minister John Howard, argued, or not argued, but said in his op-ed where he was commending the Australian law to Americans, he said something like, "Oh, it is true that we don't have a constitution or a Bill of Rights or a Second Amendment in Australia. I just want I just want to throw that difference between our societies in. Not that it makes any difference, but let me at least put it on the record. I'll give him credit for putting it on the record.
Right. Sure.
But that's true. So, what would it take? Look, we know how a mandatory buyback or mandatory confiscation would work in the United States, how it would not work. Connecticut and New York, after Sandy Hook, I believe, passed registration laws on guns, on rifles, so-called assault rifles, which is a bogus category anyway. But so you were supposed to register, and it was a dismal failure. A very small number did not register, and the state is not going after them because they know what that would entail. You need a police state to go after the people that first of all, to find out who has a gun and hasn't registered it, and then to charge them or force them to register. Now imagine if you try to do it nationwide with handguns, registration, not to mention mandatory buyback,
right.
So-called buyback. You would need a police state, and as it was the guy at the Federalist Society, I wish I could remember his name. He said, to take guns away from people, you need people with guns to do that. He said there would be a civil war if you tried to do that. If you tried to go and get 300 million, or let's say you only got the percentages that Australia was shooting for, that would be a maximum of 105 million guns. If the government tried to send out armed officers to confiscate 105 million guns in the country, think of are people going to sit? You think they just sit idly by and let it happen? No, they won't. So this is what the anti-gun lobby is advocating. Do they want those consequences, or do they not care, or are they just again living in utopia?
Well, it always seems to me sort of you have your choice between a feel-good legislation that won't stop any problems, but may catch people like Brian Aitken, Shanine Allen, some of the FAM people, and may just destroy. It may catch a couple of people and destroy their lives, but the actual problem of shootings and violence will not be fixed, and you won't really change the gun culture, whatever you want to call it, in the United States. Or you can send SWAT teams out. And I don't know if I believe there'd be a civil war or something that dramatic or not, honestly, but you would have dead cops, and you would have a couple, you'd have Ruby Ridge and Waco situations all over again. You would have, and you just have a lot of people who wouldn't obey. Maybe there'd be some nice, more law-abiding people who would just acquiesce, and there'd be a lot of people who wouldn't, and you'd have to figure out how hard you were going to go against those people. And I would hate to see liberals at that time, because I think they would go, more full police state than they could even picture themselves doing right now, because they're not thinking of the consequences of what they're advocating for. And they will not. There's two areas. There's drug war. Oh, I guess that is bad. Oh my God, the prisons are so full. And then there's oh my God, there was another shooting, we have to do something. And they're not putting these things together. They're separate islands of ideology.
Yeah.
And they can't learn from this one and apply it to this situation. Because doing nothing is, you can't do it.
Right, and at the same time, just another example of what you're saying, they hate the militarization of the police. Mm-hmm. Now, what kind of militarization would have to occur for all these guns to be confiscated? Right. Or even just mandatory registration? You'd have to send armed people out to every house, knock on the door, demand that they'd be able to come in and look for guns, because people are not likely to answer honestly if they're asked, "Do you have any guns in your house?" So,
well, you could do a gentle sort of bureaucratic thing, I suppose, and say, if you don't admit your guns, if you don't register your guns, then it's, it's a more civil type of punishment. And the way that they, snag poor people and snag people, like just the fines will build and build, something like that. I mean, I don't know. Do we have... I just think people would, I don't know.
Well, at the very least, an awful lot of people would ignore it. Mm-hmm. And, Mother Jones had an article, which I posted on Facebook too, acknowledging this. They said that's not going to, it won't do any good. I don't know what they want done, because they're in the do something crowd. But they say that a buyback, they look at buybacks. Various states have tried them, and cities have tried them, and the results have not been anything. The numbers have not been that large. I guess you could say, well, they didn't offer them enough money. But you'd have to offer, it seems to me, a lot of money to get some people to consider it, because people do value their guns for self-defense and sport and competitive shooting or hunting. I'm putting up the name on the chat window there. First of all, I put up the link to the Federalist article. And there's the author, because I wanted to give him credit, Varad Mehta, a historian. Mm. I definitely commend that article and follow the links.
Yeah, that was a good one. I read that too.
He's got links to the Charles Cook stuff, and watch for Charles Cook on National Review, because he's been really good on this. In fact, he had a great moment, more than a moment. I put it on Facebook on Morning Joe right after the Oregon shooting, and he's very, he's a Brit, so he has, first of all, he has an accent, which I guess gives him authority that we Americans don't have.
Totally does.
And he's very calm. Okay, he wasn't like me waving my arms, just sat there so calmly. And he's got 3 against 1. He's got, Mika Brzezinski, who, I don't know what she knows. What's his name? The guy from Time Magazine who covers politics. I can't remember his name now. And Howard Dean, who, by the way, comes from a state where you don't need a permit to carry concealed or open, Vermont, which is one reason why Bernie Sanders is relatively good on guns, because he probably wouldn't have gotten reelected to the Senate if he'd been bad. Now tonight, I don't know, tonight he's probably going to get, quote, better on guns from the progressive point of view, because he's up against Hillary, and Hillary now, he's not going to want Hillary outflank him on the left, so-called left on guns. So Cook was so calm in explaining that there's no connection between their proposed solutions and the thing they're trying to solve, the problem. And all Mika could say was, well, I agree with the president.
Yeah.
And what's his name? The guy from Time, Charles would say, okay, so we need to do something. What? And so the guy from Time says all of a sudden, well, I'm not an expert on policy. Every other day of the week he's pronouncing on policy, but when he's nailed to the wall by Cook, he says, well, I can't give you anything specific because I'm not the expert. Right. I wish Cook at that point had said, no one's an expert on preventing this kind of crime. There's no such thing as an expert. Right. So don't feel too bad. Why can't I remember his name? Oh, damn it. Yeah. There's so much nonsense spoken and gotten away with, but when you see somebody like Cook come along and they allow him on TV, he can destroy them.
I mean, there's just this block. I mean, and conservatives, of course, because we can never let them off the hook either, and they're not doing anything to let themselves off the hook. Cook excluded, I guess, in this case. the general attitude that to pass a law is this we should be lackadaisical about passing legislation. And they're talking about, I mean, if you care about constitutionality, they're talking about something that would, violate that by at least some interpretations. But, you have your Patriot Act and your, oh God, this happened, we got to pass this immediately. And again, like, liberals have not learned from a situation like the Patriot Act where there's a ton of anti-crime legislation in the past named after some tragic victim of something, and you have to pass this immediately, and it's always awful, and it never goes away. And they still haven't learned that you pile government up, and they want to pass it now. They're angry about obstructionist Congress and Republicans getting in the way. And if there had been an obstructionist Congress 12 years ago, there'd be a couple more alive Iraqis right now, but they never noticed. I mean, everything is in this tiny little box of this issue, and nothing, has any. You can't learn anything from government being a disaster. It has to be just this issue, and we got to do something now.
Right. Yeah, and I remember when after Sandy Hook, there was a bill that was making its way through Congress. I guess was the universal checks. I don't know what else it did, but so-called universal checks. I think I may be wrong about this. I think it passed the House, but it died in the Senate. And even some conservatives, or at least alleged conservatives, depending on how you want to define that term, Joe Scarborough was all for the bill. And when the Senate killed it, he was lamenting, oh, this is terrible. The people want this, 98%. And, even gun owners and most NRA, remember they said all this, even most NRA members think this is common sense. How could the Senate do this? Why weren't they reading the polls? Except in some other issue, especially a conservative would be saying, what's great about the genius of the founders? They built the Senate. They made the Senate. The Senate was supposed to slow things down so that passion wouldn't completely engulf the government and something would get passed in the heat of the moment. Thank goodness for the Senate. It's the brakes on the passions, the fleeting passions of the moment. Except when it came to that issue. Suddenly, how come the Senate's standing in the way? Why isn't it reading the polls? These people don't listen. Like you say, every issue is a fresh issue, right? It's never related to anything else. They don't remember what they said yesterday, when it was a different issue, but the same principle.
And the point of, they really, I know this is getting too broad, but just like the idea of the balance, the balance of power in the three branches, and like for all of the faults of the founders and the Constitution, the general intention being slow it down, and they hate that. They want it passed now. And they pass it now, worry about it later. If it's not perfect, we'll pass something else, is what we'll do. Yeah.
Or they'll say, well, at least it won't do any harm, they'd say.
And I don't know how they figure.
That's not true.
If they're literate, why they believe that.
I guess we ought to invoke the precautionary principle.
Yeah. Don't
pass this bill until you can show me 100%, with 100% satisfaction, guarantee, that no harm will come from it. Turn their own principle on them. They like to use that in other contexts.
That's a great.
I'll have to do that next time.
Me too. I'm snagging that. That'll come in handy.
Because the problem with the precautionary principle is that it's self-subverting. It can't pass itself.
True.
Right? You can't guarantee that the precautionary principle won't cause damage.
Oh God, it's all too much.
So it collapses. Don't explode there. As somebody said, to translate the precautionary principle is never do anything for the first time.
I need some time to stare at a wall and think about all this. Honestly. It's not really very.
You need to be in a sensory deprivation chamber.
Oh, I think that would be awful.
Then you can work it out. So, any questions? Any questions from the throng out there?
That's true.
Any gun control advocates in the crowd?
That would be fun. Just for a novelty, but I doubt it.
What did I do? I can't see the comments. I did something.
I don't see anything right now, but we have 15 more minutes, so if people want to
speak up, people, or
ask 7 questions the last 2 minutes, like
happened last time. We have 15 minutes according to my clock.
We do. Yes, we do.
So what angles have we not covered? Let's see. Any angles that we have missed on this? Surely we didn't hit everything in 45 minutes.
Well, somebody, who was it? Alex Perrine, who is now at Gawker. I told him gently that though I liked some of his work in the past, he did a piece kind of about gun control, and I was like, that is not one of the pieces of yours that I like. And he asked me, and I didn't really have a good answer or even some good links for him, if there was any libertarian-esque or libertarian even sort of in the neighborhood suggestions for, what can one do, if anything at all, to even try to reduce, gun violence in general, mental health. And like a liberal doesn't want the sort of thin response of that's not, this is a political philosophy about what the government can't do and what rights the individual has, and so we have nothing to say on that. But certainly a libertarian can suggest like what might stop this kind of incident. I think there might be something one could do or advocate for that could reduce it or stop a few occasions where someone was going to go off the deep end and actually didn't, which does happen. There was an interesting Esquire article, I think a couple of years ago at this point, about a guy who he went to prison for, I don't know, 7 or 10 years, and he was planning something. He didn't have a terribly clear idea, but there were guns and he had friends involved, and they got stopped by the police in sort of the wee hours of the morning, and this guy is kind of sane enough to know that he's glad that he was stopped, and you can't really identify with the mentality that would get that close to doing something like that, but things are stopped on occasion before they turn into mass homicide. So I don't know.
Yeah. A couple of things actually we haven't covered seem to try to find refuge in the mental health aspect of this, because it's a way of taking people's minds off guns.
Right.
And that's just as dangerous. Because it seems like what they're arguing, and unfortunately it's not just conservatives who agree with this, that the way to solve this problem, or at least to get it under control and limit it, is to stigmatize more people as mentally ill. Yeah. And then make sure they don't get guns. Right. Psychiatry has no good record whatsoever in predicting who's going to be violent. Psychiatrists are not even good about predicting who among their own clients or patients will be violent, much less people they don't know. They'll tell you that. I've been seeing mental health specialists lately. I always put quotes, or I imagine I'm putting quotes around mental health. I'm a Sassian. I think it's a myth. But leave that aside. That's for another day. I've been seeing psychiatrists saying, wait a second, let's not overdo this, overstate this. Most people who have these problems, they say, never commit any violence. And we know what would happen if the conservatives and the others got their way. A whole lot of people who never would have committed violence will be harassed and worse. And lots of people will go on committing murders who never come to the attention of the system, because their
murders won't be sexy enough. To use a horrible word.
They have no record. They've had no contact with the mental health system.
Right. Sure.
Which was true of some of these mass shooters. So, do we want a department of pre-crime? You've all probably seen Minority Report or read the story about the pre-crime unit, where we're going to have experts predict who's going to commit crimes, right, and then take action against them. Think of that's dystopian, not utopian. It's just dystopian.
You also have people who believe that, again, to tie back to the felon thing, the South Carolina church shooter, and I'm glad I can't remember these people's names.
I can't. Should I say it?
I don't know. Depends on who you agree with on whether that is. I don't know.
He shall remain nameless.
He either had it was a marijuana. Some people said it was a felony, but I think it might have been less than that. And there are people acting like that should have been our clue that he was about to, go on a racist murder spree. Like, what the fuck are you talking about? There are thousands of people who have drug charges who would never do something that hideous. Right. And I wish he hadn't had a gun, obviously, because then it wouldn't have been so easy to kill so many people. But the idea that we should have somehow used our psychic abilities to say, that guy looks like the shooting up a church type. I mean, it's completely absurd. And it's not, I mean, people can't handle this idea that there was, nothing to be done about it. And that doesn't mean some coincidence, someone could have called him at the right time and distracted him and that sort of thing that has happened in this world. But it just means that there was nothing, for Washington, D.C. to do about this.
Right.
I don't know.
In the case of Oregon, I thought it was really crazy too, because they have a blog post by, they think it's the same guy. He was using the handle Lithium Lover, and for some reason they have reason to think it's him. Maybe that's been nailed down. I don't know. But I saw this quote. They said, but the day before or recently before the shooting, he had posted this and said something like, I wish I had the exact quote. It said something like, he was talking about the Virginia, the Roanoke shooter, the guy that shot the two TV people. The person, he says, this person was unknown, and now that he shot, these two people, he's very well known, and his name is known, and it seems like the more people you shoot, the better known you'll be. That's not verbatim, but that's very close. That could have been said by any analyst. Thinking about this, that's a sign. That's supposed to be a sign of a guy who is intending to go out and shoot up a school.
That's absurd.
There was nothing. There was absolutely nothing in the quotation.
Yeah.
They said, "Oh gosh, why didn't we realize it?" Now looking back, why didn't we realize that was a sign?
That's what all the people say in response to this is that we should stop saying their names because the more people you kill, the more notoriety you have. As you say, any analysts. They've been saying this for weeks.
Anybody can say that.
Yeah.
There was nothing to indicate, I'd like to do this, or, this is how I'm going to get famous. He didn't say anything like that. He just said, hey, it seems like the more people you kill, the more an obscure person gets known.
Right.
So you can write an op-ed about that. Does that mean
have so many signs that are creepy. I have a Spotify themed playlist that's full of murder ballads, and basically the theme is murder. It's a very morbid song playlist. I find certain historical things, morbid things fascinating. I find Timothy McVeigh interesting because it's like he was a libertarian and he went horribly, horribly wrong. I mean, I like to imagine if I had gone to public school. And I was weird in high school as well and stuff. I wasn't wearing black trench coats and the Columbine myth kind of bullshit. I might have flown under the radar, but there are so many weirdos. Some of us are a little morbid and think about really downer topics, like the one we're having conversation right now, and just this idea that again, another thing conservatives should know better about, because they're usually down with being outraged about a zero tolerance. An anecdote if it's the right kind of person. Yeah. In school, he wrote a story and he got, expelled. Schools are so dumb. They're so hysterical. This is,
right.
that hunting kid in Western PA left his gun in his car and he forgot about it. Now he's expelled and they're charged. They hate that stuff. They're right about that. But, they still, Ann Coulter and idiots like that, I've read stuff where they blame the ACLU because it's harder to throw someone in the crazy house without them having done anything first. They
used to blame Tom Sast for that.
Right. That's another good topic.
Because he was really the first to make a big issue of those snake pits, those places, and people being forced into them. But that's a separate subject. The other thing I was mentioning regarding illness in connection with the Oregon guy, and then it's related to the Sandy Hook case. His mother had posted that both she and her son, this is Oregon, have Asperger's or had Asperger's, so that puts them on the spectrum, right, for autism. So it's funny the way the networks, CNN and the others, talked about this. When that was a news story the next day, they read the quotes from the woman's post. She's a nurse. She says, I have Asperger's. My son has it. I understand it. This was before the shooting. So the network would talk about all this and say, oh, isn't that interesting? Adam Lanza had Asperger's too, but then they quickly say, but there's no evidence that somebody with Asperger's is more likely to commit violence than anybody else, and probably less likely. But then after they say that as a disclaimer, they then say, but it is interesting that there's this pattern, because Adam Lanza also had Asperger's. In other words, there is a connection, it seems to me, they're saying, even though they said, for the record, there's no connection. But isn't it interesting that both those guys had
that there is
Asperger's?
A connection.
And then the people who, of course, work in that field, the specialists in that field, are like appalled. They're horrified now that people with Asperger's are getting stigmatized as potential mass murderers.
Yeah.
But this is the way the conservatives are going, because they think, oh, good, guns are over there, so I'm heading over there to mental illness or neurological stuff.
I'm stuck on this thing. It's these little bubbles, and there's no overriding principle. There's no overriding logic and learning from how the world works, how laws work, or more to the point, fail to work. It's all tiny little bubbles of issues and partisanship, and they can't learn anything. And they're all so awful.
Right. Look, we have to keep reminding people, this is a big, relatively open society. It's still a pretty open society as far as just coming and going, and you don't need permission to ride down the street, or most of your life, well, I was going to say, is pretty unobserved. I guess what the internet said, you can't quite say that anymore. But it's still it's a big open society, and very diverse, with urban areas, rural, suburban, all those things. To think that you can have a law or some complex of laws that are going to make something like this highly unlikely is, again, we're getting back to magic and utopia. You can say it all you want, but get real. There are things we can do, and sometimes we should be talking about gun-free zones, especially government mandated ones. Private property owners ought to be able to say no guns, but we can also decide we don't want to go there if it's a gun-free restaurant. Libertarians ought to be a little bit careful about overstating it, and anybody else who doesn't like gun-free zones, because we don't know that if somebody shoots up a gun-free zone, we don't know just by that fact alone that that's the reason the person chose that location. So let's not leap and say, X% were in gun-free zones, so therefore it's gun-free zones. I'm against them.
Or, again, a private restaurant like that horrible Texas shooting 30-some years ago, where that poor woman lost both her parents.
Oh, yeah.
Her gun was in the car, and I can't imagine how haunting for the rest of your fucking life that would be. But by the same token, a restaurant.
That was in Luby's cafeteria in Killeen, Texas.
Yeah. That is their prerogative to bar guns.
Near Fort Hood, by the way. And her name was Suzanne Gracia, and then Suzanne Gracia Hupp. She got married after that. She went in. You're right. That was a terrible story. They did not have concealed carry back then in Texas, and she used to carry a gun. She had just recently got her chiropractic license, and didn't want to take a chance in losing the license by being caught with the handgun. She was a totally law-abiding person. Yeah. That day, she's going to lunch with her parents in Luby's, and she leaves the gun in her glove compartment in her car. Yeah. That's the day that, what was his name, William Hennard or something like that, comes driving through the plate glass window of the restaurant in his car, gets out, everybody gets to the ground, he's the only one standing, and he's mowing people down. Her father runs to try to stop the guy, he gets shot. His mother runs over to her father, she gets shot. Suzanne is under the table, who says, I had a clear shot at the guy. He's the only guy standing. If I had imagine how she felt. My gun's over there outside in the glove box of my car.
That's disturbing.
That's right. Those don't get counted, though. Those don't get counted in the statistics. We only count the murders and the mass shootings. We don't count the people who die because they had no way to defend themselves.
Right.
Do you need to plug something? It's 6 o'clock. I see I was going to say 6 o'clock. It may not be 6 o'clock where you are. It's the top of the hour.
Yes, very anchory. I will say that I hear Students for Liberty is doing a live chat at 10. I'm not sure which one of those crazy kids are on that panel, but that's worth tuning into if people want more stuff to watch tonight. That's all that I know of. I don't have a link for that offhand, but it's on Liberty.me. If you're already on Liberty.me, you can find it. I have faith in you.
Okay, well, thank everybody for showing up.
Yes, go read. Thank you, audience, and future audience, and read all of Sheldon's stuff. Go to his Free Association blog. Read him at Reason. He was on the Independent Institute's blog recently.
Yeah.
He still has a Patreon. You can give him money. That's a good
Lucy's
thing.
at Anti-War. And what else do you write for?
Well, I did
Rice
the
or something?
Federalist thing a couple weeks ago, just like a weird movie review that's not very political. Therefore, no one paid attention to it. That's
Well,
okay.
read her insights on foreign policy, which we will probably discuss next time. We were going to do it this time, but then the gun thing kind of took over.
Yeah, but this was a good one. I mean, not to be happy about the news hook, but it certainly.
Will will always be with us, so we'll get a shot at your thesis about shifting views on intervention.
Or I'll write something better tonight and tomorrow. Hopefully, we'll see. So yeah.
Okay.
Read us all. Read our stuff and watch us now and in the future, and join us next time. And thank you, Sheldon. It was a good.
Three from tonight. Thank you. Bye, Lucy.
Bye.